Mr. Barnes, how are you doing today, sir? You doing all right? Thank you so much for being here.
Well, I usually prefer Samuel.
You know, us
Yeah, no, I'm
Virginian
doing all right.
people, these old habits, I tell you what. Well, Samuel, thank you for being here today, sir. You doing all right?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's a good day.
Oh, outstanding. Well, Samuel, congratulations on Missing Axioms. It is elegant. It is insightful. It's quite an accomplishment to finish a book. It has a wonderful style. It's very easy to recognize. I love the pictures that you include, and I love the flow of the argument. It just goes together so well. What are some of the things that inspired Missing Axioms? What got your gears turning on the subject?
So, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, the main sort of impetus is that people say certain things, but they do other things. They're not usually congruent. That sort of stuff. And I noticed this myself. I was always talking about the book I was going to write. I wasn't, doing a whole lot of writing at the time. And we're in this new world right now, and I found myself with a bit of time on my hands last October. So I wouldn't call it so much a book, but it's definitely a series of essays. And to be honest with you, they fitting together pretty well. So I was like, this is cool. Let's do this. So I combining, we'll get into this, but combining my explicit and implicit self, I call myself a writer. So there you go.
Oh, well, I love, I do a lot of fiction writing, and we talk a lot about showing but not telling, and how that's kind of based on the idea that very often people, what they say is not what they show. And also, if you really want to know what a person is, who they are and what they believe, you want to watch what they're doing. Very often words are actually kind of red herrings. They actually will say the opposite of what is the case. And I really like how you talk about the difference between the explicit and the implicit position of the nihilist. So for me, using that fiction writing language, it's kind of the idea that you can tell people you're a nihilist, but it's very difficult to show it. You really can't even show it. And so what would you say when we talk about like this difference between the implicit and the explicit position of the nihilist? Could you elaborate on that some?
Yeah, so that's one of the more formal parts of the work, is the distinction between explicit value and implicit value. The reason why I've sort of drawn that distinction is that I explicitly say, hey, I'm a writer, right? I can go around to everyone in the town and say, hey, I'm a writer. But implicitly, through my actions, I could never have actually written anything, right? You can go out to a cafe or a pub or whatever. You can say, hey, I'm a writer, and then no one's who's gonna. It's like it's like a valuing fact check, if you will. But essentially, yeah, explicit is the overt values, right? So you might be flying a communist flag, you'd be flying all sorts of that. These are explicit symbols. They're explicitly what you're doing, right? But the implicit is the values that come from, they emanate from what you actually do, right? So by getting up and going to work in the morning, I sort of I'm implicitly valuing the system that substantiates that sort of work. But yeah, basically the distinction is that explicit is words, symbols, discursive symbols specifically. This is where I draw on the work of Langer in my book. And then the implicit stuff is that's the stuff that actually that's the action. And these things it's well, I think it's quite a cliche thing to say, people don't always do what they say, but there's a philosophical distinction here in terms of the way we value things. And people talk is cheap. That's the explicit stuff. But there's also this implicit angle, which is the way people actually act as well.
Oh no! Well, it's a cliche, but that cliche gets absorbed into the mechanisms by which people tell and don't show, right? They almost say that in order to convince themselves they're not falling into that trap, and then proceed to do it. So it's very important to sort of shake people and remind them of how prevalent that mistake is. It kind of reminds me, I guess, of the Frankfurt School when they talk about ideology, and how one of the ways that ideology operates is by making you believe that what you believe is what you think you believe and what you say, but actually it's the material condition that you participate in, and how you see that in religion as well. There's an emphasis on faith, but there can be faith by actions or faith to a sort of Cartesian, Descartesian what you think, and so you get this mixed up with Cartesianism. Today it becomes especially prevalent as a problem because people think their truest self is what they think based on this vision of people as, brains on sticks, I suppose. Would it be fair to say then that one of the arguments you're making in the book, which again, I cannot stress enough how everyone hearing this needs to read it, and then people not hearing this conversation need to read it, because who's ever hearing this needs to go tell them to buy it, would it be fair to say that it is actually impossible to show nihilism? That it is only something you can tell? Is it actually, in a sense, even possible to be a nihilist?
So this is stepping forward a bit further is, okay, we have this implicit explicit distinction, right? And when someone says they're a nihilist, that's their excuse for being a hedonist or something like this, right? So and there's, like I said, there's the discursive symbols of nihilism, like F you, nothing matters, whatever, right? But we're embodied beings, like things happen in the world. Things happen implicitly, whether we like it or not, right? So even the person who's like, F you, F the world, whatever,
matter, right?
They're they go and they do their hedonistic stuff, and they're implicitly, through their action, valuing these hedonistic things. So this is one of the other points in the book, is that you can explicitly say that you're a nihilist, but you can never implicitly be a nihilist. And the thing is, right, so this is one of the, again, coming back to your original question of like, why write this book, right? What's the importance of this, is that, I think philosophy views, especially academic philosophy, views nihilism as kind of like a boogeyman. Like, they're very scared of it, There's like the challenge of nihilism and all this sort of stuff. And the thing is, right, I'm not scared, because all these people who say they're nihilists, or might even entertain the idea of nihilism, all this skepticism, when you implicitly act, you have to choose a value. Things are valuing in themselves, whether you like it or not, basically.
So in a sense, it's impossible to be a kind of negating nihilist. It's impossible to exist in a state that's sort of negating values or negating experience, because you're going to be in the world. And the moment you are in the world, you are participating. Because in my mind, I think a lot of people hear nihilist and there's something subtractive about it. There's something sort of negative, like it's almost like a black hole sort of sucking the world into it. So if I understand, you are suggesting that vision of nihilism is not possible, because you're in the world and thus acting.
Well, I mean, we can go back to the definition of nihilism, which is that nothing matters.
Right.
Like ultimately nothing matters, right? And then what that implies is a world devoid of anything, really. It implies there's all these things happening, but like ultimately it doesn't matter, right? And unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I think fortunately, but we're sort of thrown into this thing. That's the Heideggerian Wolfenheit, I believe. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there. But,
sounded good to me.
And you sort of have to. There's this impetus to decide. It's not something we have discursive control over. You can say you can talk as much as you want, but this is just the fact. And I really feel like although I think the book is quite short in a lot of sections and doesn't really elaborate, I feel like it really is, especially in the early parts, a sort of logical deduction of this stuff. I feel like because it really sort of cuts to the bone of what it means to value, right?
Well, on what you're saying about being thrown into experience, I love that line that you have where you say later in the book, experience affirms itself by virtue of its having content. Really love that phrase. And that's so nice. That's just another example of your mastery of language and ability to take complicated ideas and word it in such a manner that really captures the reader and is easy to remember. And also, too, on what you're saying on the question of values, I like the work, because I think you're correct. A lot of people encounter the problem of nihilism, the problem of not having values. And there's this sort of idea that if we believe that nothing matters, then therefore, life is going to be valueless and there will be lots of problems. And you have that part toward the end where you said the human truth is that you have values which emanate from you explicitly and implicitly. Human beings can never be contentless. Values spew from us in every stride or stumble. Oh, I love that. I love that phrase at the end. That sort of meta. We just have to participate in values. So the idea that valueless nihilism is impossible, that's sort of taken care of here, and we will elaborate on that. Is there any harm in people calling themselves a nihilist in the classical way, or to misunderstand nihilism? Are there any unintended consequences that can emerge from that? Perhaps the fear of nihilism you've noted. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
I mean, this is sort of, where people come when they, the challenge of nihilism is the worry that, nothing's going to matter to certain people and they're going to be certain, like, chaotic in some sort of way, right?
Right.
But I suppose the issue is it was all to do with authenticity, and I talk about authenticity a lot in the book. And it's one of those weird things where I don't know, I think generally in societies, but specifically in our current one, is, there's this idea of authenticity, right? And that's, from the way you think to the way you act, there's this, there's a coherence, right? And the issue with nihilism with me, I'm not particularly worried if people are going to become hedonistic or violent or anything. The worry with me is that there's a disconnection between what people do and what they say, right? So someone says, as soon as you say you're a nihilist, because of the logical deduction that I lay out in the book, there's a disconnect between the implicit valuing and the explicit valuing. And this is a it's one of those things that, okay, in a nihilistic world it might not matter, but as valuing beings, like we value, that's a quite a Nietzschean thing to bring up. But whether we like it or not, there is something happening in front of us, and that's the implicit side. And this sort of stuff, it tugs at our conscience normally. When there's a disunification between what you're saying and what you're doing, there's a problem with your conscience. And this is when I talk about Socrates, right? He talks about this kind of inner voice that speaks to him, and it's really weird. It's like a weird primordial kind of angel and devil on the shoulder that he talks about. But I think authenticity is the root of the conscience, the human conscience. And that's based on the disconnection, the more often disconnected than unified, explicit self and implicit self that we find ourselves in.
Well, and it's not, I think today you do have increasingly more and more people who are becoming nihilist, or believing, or they have a position where maybe they don't directly call themselves a nihilist, but they pretty much are like, well, no, it's all arbitrary. Everyone has different values. Values are nothing more than taste, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which, even if there's some truth
to, there's an election going on today, who cares, right?
Yeah, right. What does it matter at the end of the day? And you see, what's very interesting about your argument is there's a kind of notion that that position can never be lived. And so, but if people think it's a live option or a real option, they're going to live never taking the responsibility of asking the questions of what are the values they live. And then what can happen, I just have this image of almost like smoke. They're still going to have values, but since they're not going to take the time to think about it because they're a nihilist or nothing matters, they're still going to live out values. And because they don't take the time to own them or to think about them, those values could be problematic, or maybe you could be captured by a dictator, or maybe the state, or religious fanaticism, because you're still going to absorb values. It's impossible not to have them. And it's almost like if you don't take the time to think about your values are going to be picked for you by something outside. It makes me think too, you mentioned Heidegger. He talked about kind of technology and your thinking captured by technology, and that's Deleuze as well. And I couldn't help but reading this kind of going, man, reading your book, it's like if people don't, if they think nihilism absolves them the responsibility of living according to values, then they're going to be extraordinarily susceptible to capture, or unintentionally participating in things and not even realizing they're participating in them. And then, but you mentioned authenticity. Perhaps there's also some kind of temptation into wanting to believe nihilism gets rid of the problem of values, because authenticity is hard. It's difficult to live according to values and to own them, and you have to almost think philosophically and kind of be aware. So maybe there's also some sort of temptation to define nihilism in the way that's problematic we've been describing, because that can absolve you some difficulty. But then, of course, the problem is if you do that, you're susceptible to capture.
Yeah, that's put it really well, actually. I think the issue basically is that the explicit self is open to a lot of things, right? And I talk about the kamikaze in Japan specifically in the book. And it's a bizarre situation because I thought that going into that research that I would find, you know, a bunch of ideologically like possessed young men who were like, yeah, let's go fly the planes of the Allied ships. But that's completely opposite of what you find.
Wow.
And it's weird because people think that they find freedom in the explicit self, right? What they put forth vocally and symbolically and all this sort of stuff. But the real freedom, and this is the reason with the kamikaze, but they're, you know, Tokkōtai in Japanese, there's a linguistic sort of description that happens in the book as well, where I kind of clarify what that actually means. But there's a sense of freedom that comes from, you know, what's happening within, right? And this is a weird, like, it's kind of like pseudo spiritual in a way, but it's kind of real, right? Because a lot of these guys were like devout communists, and that's in a logical sense. They were like communist, right? They were, and they were like, you know, very sort of split between their, you know, explicit devotion to the nation, but a lot of them did it to, you know, they thought they were defending their homeland, this sort of stuff. And it really sort of threw the book in the direction it went, because I thought that it would be a very, you know, straight, like the martyr is a real problem. But as it turns out, you know, there's a lot of martyrdom that happens, which is, you know, there's a real disunity between what people explicitly say and what they implicitly do.
Oh yeah, I love those sections, and to me that was an example of, you know, I use the language of capture, sort of nationalistic capture, and then you talk about Christianity, you know, of religious capture, where, and again, this problem of the idea of the disunity of self between the implicit and the explicit, the showing and the telling per se, I really do think it's a pressing problem because, you know, for example, let's take the dictator, right? You know, nobody intends to vote for a dictator. Nobody intends to support a dictator, right? I mean, you know, a dictator is bad, and yet people do all the time. Dictators are voted for. People. So how does that occur? Because somehow in people's minds, the act of supporting the dictator is defending freedom or saving the nation or keeping out the bad guy. So they're not a
this is the disunity between the explicit and the implicit. Right?
Yeah, and also
the explicit is like, well, we're electing the dictator to defend freedom, but what's like implicitly, what is a dictator, right?
Oh, well, you know, and right there is the irony, right? You're electing someone who gets rid of freedom in the name of freedom, right? And you see again, as a fiction writer, so much of great literature is defined by irony, and you know, Harold Bloom does a lot of work on that. But if you look at the great literature, there, in a good reading of Kafka's *The Trial*, for example, which I think is a very important book.
Oh,
you know,
God, we can talk. That's a whole separate discussion.
Well, and you know, who rings the bell at the beginning of that book to summon the police? Joseph K. does. He rings the bell. And who's the one who goes and stands in front of the court? Joseph K. He digs himself deeper and deeper and deeper into the problem. And at the end of the book, very important, they turn the knife toward him. They're like, here's the handle. And they wait for him to take it. And they're like, well, why don't you go do this? You know, so there's this idea of participating. You know, you don't know what the crime is, but then you participate in a way that helps make yourself guilty. So it's not simply, what's so interesting about that is it's not simply a system of control that's forcing Joseph K. Into like a kind of more of a 1984. It's actually, for me, Kafka's more, you know, if you know, Neil Postman said, you know, if you have to choose between Orwell and Huxley, you know, you choose Huxley because people tend to destroy themselves by pleasure at the beginning of amusing ourselves to death. Well, actually, I think Kafka is the third option. And what Kafka is this participation in these mechanisms of control where, yes, there is a system controlling you, but you are also, it's symbiotic, participating it in a manner. And that's the vision you have in Kafka, like that wonderful little fable where the mouse is in the hall and he's like, oh me, oh my, the walls are getting closer and I can't find my way out and there's a trap up ahead. What will I do? And the cat said, you simply change your direction, and ate up the mouse. You know, there's also something funny in Kafka where then when we turn to a solution, the thing that gives us the solution to give us freedom back is the dictator who's going to eat us and take it away. And the way we can end up in those situations is easily the split between the implicit and the explicit. And I think we see that in Kafka very well. And I think you see it in the world today, don't you? I mean, you see these sort of rationalizations of certain political movements or certain silencing of opposition, of which in your name is freeing people or increasing justice or whatever, conservative, liberal, both sides. But since you have that split, there's this failure to have a certain level of self-criticism. And also, lastly, whenever there's a split between implicit and explicit, there is a mechanism of self-hiding that occurs to make it seem like that's not occurring. And so there's a certain mechanism. And so again, I think your work is so important because no one, almost by definition, no one can think that there's someone in whom the explicit and the implicit is divided. You know, if you thought that, it would eat you alive. So there's mechanisms of self-hiding. And I think it's like by going to the question of nihilism and exploring nihilism on the ground level, that actually gives insight into all of these ideological mechanisms. You know, it's like going to square one so you can get, you know, to get a better view of square 98, if you will, further along the line.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the definition of the axioms. That's the title of the book. That's the point. Like the missing axioms. So when you realize there's a disunity between your implicit self and your explicit self, right? And then you end up, you know, the Kafka's brilliant. I mean, I should have, you know, I could write a Missing Axioms too, just all on Kafka. But you know, this is
he's a man, absolutely.
When you're disunified, you wake up and you're a cockroach. You know, you're a disgusting. Well, I think the literal translation is like a disgusting thing, and it's never really said a cockroach.
That's key, exactly. Yeah, and he's thinking about getting to work. He's like, oh crap, I'm going to be late for work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, or you know, the night before you did something, you're like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, or you know, in any reasonable mind, I never would have done that sort of thing. You know, you wake up and you look at yourself, you're a disgusting thing, right? And then you contrast that, you know, the big cockroach who can't get off the bed. You contrast that with someone like Socrates, who's, you know, as he, you know, he's a complete, like, at least the mythical Socrates, that is, is a, you know, complete unity of the implicit and explicit self. And that's a unity unto death as well. We can talk about that specifically if you want, but I don't know sort of where we want to go.
Oh no, that's true. Would you say so on the character of, so first off, let's just assume nihilism is true. Let's just assume it's the case, or something like nihilism, which is in a sense impossible.
This is the thing. I have to interrupt. This is the thing, right?
Sure,
because, sure. Like externally, like the thing in it, like the thing in itself, right? Let's just say nihilism is true, right? Let's just say we're embodied beings, right?
Right.
We act like this is the implicit explicit distinction, right? Like the thing in itself, the explicit distinction. And that's reality, by the way, as well. That could be reality. It could even scream out to us, nothing matters, nothing consequentially matters. We're human beings, right? Like this is another important thing to bring up from the book, is that, you know, we've talked about, you know, laying in bed all day, that sort of stuff, but like suicide as well is a very pressing issue here.
Right.
Like, okay, aren't you a nihilist if you're like, well, the world would be better without my existence? That sort of stuff, right. You know, like, but you know, the implicit implication from the act of suicide is that, you know, there's a value in my extinguishing from existence. It's weird. It's like, even in the most nihilistic act we can imagine, there's an implicit valuing that's going on.
That's right.
Well, I think that's quite important to acknowledge as well.
Oh, it's key, because, you know, the funny thing is, take the phrase "nothing matters." Well, nothing matters. You know, there's no way to even state the principles of nihilism. You know, very often when you state the principles of nihilism, embedded in that very sentence could be a turn where you say nothing matters. Well, then nothing matters, right? You know, and so it's impossible to fully have a unity without having that almost Schrodinger's cat doubleness that is occurring, that can always be observed into a state of values, even if yourself are trying not to, because like you say, you could blast it. Well, the moment you kill yourself, then, you know, then there is a value that is embedded in that very act. And I guess the question I was gonna get at is, one, it sounds like that something that's quite important is learning how to live with a certain unity between the explicit and the implicit, as we sort of see in Socrates. Would you say that Socrates is an option for people today? That it's possible for people in our pluralistic society? What would it mean to sort of try to not live in a state of bad faith, which arguably the nihilists can kind of do? What would that look like in your mind?
Yeah, Socrates is an interesting one, and this is it's sort of invoked. And I think I mentioned this place. Kind of, you know, he's kind of like the academic ideal in a way. It's kind of like forms like a new religion, right? It's kind of like, oh, you know, he was so honest that he killed himself. This sort of stuff. But there's a kind of acceptance in Socrates, right? Because there's all these attributes to him, you know, where he's embodying the intellectual ideal, but also, and this is what really perturbed me, I think, and I think it was quite pressing with the various laws that came in for coronavirus and stuff. You know, there's not just the intellectual ideal, there's not just yourself, but there's also the city. There's the other intellects that exist around you, right? And that's, and I mean, like we've stuck in this conversation so far to, you know, the explicit implicit within the self. But there's also the explicit and implicit within society, right?
Right.
Well, and you know, again, we can talk about Nozick and all the libertarian, you know, critiques, but at the end of the day, when you are living within the city, you're also implicitly implying that you will die within the city as well. This is the great insight of Socrates' death, actually. Is that his whole shtick is that, you know, he makes his case, he embodies the intellectual ideal, but when the city decides that it's his time to come, he graciously takes it. And this is why he's remembered the way he is, but also the reason why he's so, I think, misunderstood, you know, because I feel like there's a lot of explicit deviation in what Socrates says from how he ends up, right? There's a lot of explicit deviation, but again, in his implicit self, he sees that, you know, I've lived with the city, let's go.
Interesting. Is there a sense in which Socrates, you know, so like you mentioned, Socrates can be sort of held up as an academic ideal, and maybe even one could say a non-religious ideal or a secular ideal in some respects. But is there something about Socrates that is not adequate for us today, or there's something problematic in the person of Socrates where holding him up could be in some respects as problematic as holding up the possibility of nihilism?
That is a good question. In terms of Socrates and the ideal, I feel like this is the real problem with the communal explicit, right? Because we could all explicitly agree that, you know, okay, our new society is going to be based on the ideas of Socrates, right? But, you know, that doesn't work for most people. And this is the issue with missing axioms, right? Is that, you know, other people are prescribing all this stuff for you, you know, get a house, get a mortgage, get all this stuff, or maybe go to university, all this sort of stuff. But, you know, implicitly, the way things play themselves out in the world doesn't work for most people. And yeah, I don't, again, this is something I mentioned in the book, but I don't think he should be held up as an ideal. It's just an example, right? And there are a wide range of ideals given. There's a wide range of, like, you know, these explicit and implicit unities given in the book, where, you know, you've got Socrates, you've got the Tokkōtai, where, you know, you see where the Kamikaze story, where the explicit and implicit deviates a little bit, and then you've got the figure of Christ, where, you know, the implicit and explicit deviates again, right?
Is it?
Again, this is the issue. This is the problem of missing axioms. This is I think this is the root of nihilism, is that, you know, what ideal do we choose? Which one of these one of these deities do we choose? And we don't know. I don't know. I feel like if every individual really, you know, understood the fact that they have a disunity between their explicit and implicit selves and thought about it, maybe they'd be able to find their own deity. But, you know, as we talked about, you know, the explicit self is just so open to capture unless you're in control of that.
Oh, no, it's excellent. And so you're starting on sort of an individual level of the breakdown of the implicit and the explicit. You move up to a social level of the implicit and the explicit. And you have a kind of an example. What's so interesting about Socrates is it's almost like at the end of his life, he's trying to unify the implicit and the explicit on the social level. But in so doing, there's a break on the individual level of Socrates between what he says and what he actually does. And so you have this, it's, you know, you talk about there being caves all the way up toward the end of your book on this idea. So on the individual level, we have this problem of, you know, how do we, I like the language of axioms because, you know, it's kind of mathematical. You build your system based on that. But if it's not possible.
The groundwork, right?
Yes, the groundwork. That's right. And so if on the individual level, there's a groundwork that's going to be missing, or that we can never say confirm with certainty, or something like that. Or maybe we can even say that today I unify my explicit and implicit, but tomorrow I don't. Maybe it's always an asymptote line, where they come close, but I never quite get there.
You're having a bad day, right? Because this happens. Right? This is the embodied self, is you have a bad day sometimes. Right?
Yeah, Monday, Wednesday.
You're not always Socrates taking the hemlock. Sometimes
that's right, So, you have these two lines that are close, but it never quite gets there. So there's always going to be a missing touch almost. This is the groundwork, you're always going to be missing the touch with the sum of your life. And that can be existentially destabilizing to realize. And it can also be existentially destabilizing to realize that there are the explicit, implicit social values that you are caught up in that you're also missing. So you're missing a little bit on the individual level, you're missing a little bit on the social level. Oh, and if you're not missing it on the social level, you might be captured. If the implicit and the explicit are together on the social, then your life might be run by something else. So in order to unify it on the social level, you might be suffering individual alienation. So that's not too good. And it's almost like today, increasingly because of pluralism, I talk a lot about sort of the sociologists like Berger and Reef and these different people. And they talk about how today there are no givens being the things that you can believe are true without having to think about them. So for example, if you go 100 years back, your neighbors are all Christian, you're Christian, you don't really think about, is Christianity true or not? It just is. It's thoughtless. Now, thoughtless here does not mean stupid. It's just something that's given. It's sort of an assumption. But as you go into pluralism and you see, your neighbor's a Hindu, you have atheists in school, suddenly you realize, oh my goodness, what was a given was actually just an assumption. Well, the moment you do that, it's like Wittgenstein said, repairing a tradition is like restoring a spider web with your bare hands. Once the givens are kind of broke, you can't really get them back because now you're thinking about them. And the moment you're thinking about it, it doesn't quite work. And so what's increasingly happening today under pluralism, it seems like more and more people on the individual level are realizing that the way that they felt like they had a unity between their implicit and explicit self was thanks to societal givens that they didn't have to think about, that are breaking up. And as they're thinking about them, they can see more and more of this sort of open horizon of possibilities that is existentially destabilizing. And I think that under those conditions, following Berger, someone like a totalitarian dictator is very appealing because they're going to take you back to when the nation was great again and things were given. And so learning to live with these sort of gaps on the individual level, on the social level, on not having the given, so we don't even have to, I guess the quick way I would say it is society used to have mechanisms that hid the problems of missing axioms from us by making them things we didn't have to think about. And increasingly, those givens are not there. So we're having to think about it. And the response people are having to what you are outlining as it's becoming more and more personalized in their life does not seem to be very good. And so the question really becomes, how does the average individual, obviously there are going to be some people, a minority of people who are going to be okay with it. They'll learn to live with it. But we tend to live in democratic societies or societies where the majority have a say. So the question for me that's so interesting that I like to discuss in some of the stuff I do is, what does it look like? How do you get the average person to sort of live with the increasingly personalized reality of missing axioms, both on the individual and social level? Does that make sense? That sort of outline of the situation?
Yeah, obviously there's a lot to talk about there.
Yes.
One of the things that makes missing axioms really obvious is the threat of death, right? So I've come back to this a couple of times, but the Kamikaze of Japan, so the Tokkōtai, they're called Tokkōtai. I've got to use Tokkōtai because it's more proper.
Yeah.
Right. And it's bizarre with them, right? Because you have this, absolutely euphoric example of ideology, like Imperial Japan spreading out across East Asia, just absolutely devouring and destroying, and absolutely just dominating everything. And then within these examples where you think they would be embodying the samurai ethic, all this sort of thing, which is a constructed thing, by the way, which I can cover in the book as well. Where you think that you have this really disunified and disencouraged populace. You have these students who are forced into the situation. The night before they go out, their kamikaze runs, their you know, they're drinking a lot, they're getting crazy, they're, you know, crying, they're breaking up the barracks, all this sort of stuff. And it really shows, you know, there's something really, especially, you know, especially when they have, you know, they have wives or children like this, you have, they leave behind, you know, letters and all this sort of stuff. In a way, they are unfree, and this is the I think Missing Axioms really does come back to freedom. They are unfree in the fact that they're, you know, caught up in the machinations of history as they go on. But they were free in, you know, who they wanted to pen their actions to, who they wanted to, you know, write their diaries for, who they wanted to read before they, you know, died, all this sort of stuff. You know, it's quite tragic, really. It is tragic. That's the story of human history, really, isn't it? It's tragedy. I think, you know, there's this obsession with freedom, and it's an explicit freedom, right? I can go in the shop without a mask on. That's sort of explicit freedom. But the real freedom is found within, you know, it's found within those irreducible deontologies. It's found within legal sources. It's not found in the explicit, because that's all cheap talk. As far as I'm concerned.
So first, you know, and I really do, I certainly felt as I was reading Missing Axioms that there was in the background this question of freedom, which I find a fascinating question. And, you know, one of the things it's almost to suggest is that by making the mistake that explicit freedom is freedom, because that's an idea, you know, ideas have consequences. That's a lens by which you see the world. You know, there's a lot of people, I always talk about how there's a lot of people that think, oh, you know, I'm a practical person. I don't worry about ideas. You know, philosophy is that abstract study over there. Well, here's the problem. You can't avoid having a philosophy. You can't avoid having ideas through which you understand the world. And if it is very likely, say in capitalism, for example, you know, capitalism really does want you to think that the explicit self is where you find freedom. So if you have X, Y, and Z, if you have certain status, is if you're able to do certain things, that can be seen that therefore you are free. And so the whole idea of implicit freedom, let alone unity between those things, is off the table. And if you don't realize that explicit freedom is not true freedom, well, you're going to think you're free when you're captured, when you're not free. And so that's just an example where, you know, again, a lot of people think philosophy doesn't matter. And sometimes, unfortunately, since universities just tend to teach the history of philosophy, now this is the vast generality, but not really sort of philosophical inquiry. I always found it funny. You'd walk in a classroom and the professor would say, this class uses a Socratic method. They never used the Socratic method once, but they would say it because they knew that's the implicit, explicit divide there. But anyway, so by people thinking that explicit freedom is actual freedom, they're really easy to be taken advantage of. When, like you say, it's found in the implicit self. But let me ask you this, is it possible for anyone to unify the implicit or the explicit? Or is it two options? One, you just ignore the explicit. You try to, but then of course the problem is, how do you escape the city, right? Aristotle said that if you escape the city, you're either a god or an animal. So it seems like you have to participate somehow in society. But, you know, theoretically, at least, you know, could you have the option of getting off the grid and then focusing on the implicit freedom? Or is instead what we have to do is figure out a way to explicitly and implicitly unify, both on the social level and on the individual level, which Socrates gives us an example of where that's very difficult. It may not be possible. So I guess we would say this: do you think that's possible to have an individual freedom that unifies the individual explicit and implicit while simultaneously having a social life that unifies the explicit and the implicit on the social level? Or is instead what we have to do is find freedom in not being able to do that, in a sort of imperfection, on a sort of like, we fail, but maybe we can fail better, as sort of Cornel West will say sometimes? You know, what would you say? Because I'm looking for the meaning of life, you know, the solution to all my problems, you know, Samuel, I need that, you know, this weekend, you know.
You won't get it from me. You have to pay a lot.
Oh, come now, Samuel.
You have to pay a lot more for that book. No, unfortunately, no. There's no relief to this.
Right.
Like this is the human condition. Everyone's crying out for the, you know, explicit dictator that's going to tell them how to live their lives.
That's right.
Everything's going to be hunky dory. You know, it's going to be great. there's no relief to this sort of stuff. The relief is kind of in the process itself. We just we're all sort of on this boat going towards the end of the cliff, and I don't know where we're going to end up, but we can make the best of it while we do it. And the thing is, right, is that, again, it's very important how I bring up the subject of the mythical Socrates as opposed to the actual Socrates, because are we going to pretend that Socrates didn't ever make a bad joke at a dinner party? Are we going to pretend like Socrates didn't date someone who he didn't really want to date, and we're going to pretend that he was like the perfect human being? Right. This we all falter in our own ways, but we are remembered through the moments when we unify the implicit and explicit. Socrates is remembered for that. Jesus is remembered for that. The Tokkōtai are in a macabre kind of way remembered for that. But on closer inspection, maybe not. Maybe that's not the truth. There's a difference, right? And yeah.
Well, there is. Well, one, the subtitle of your book, a philosophy of disorientation, and I think that's extremely important because, one of the, I guess it's Adorno and Horkheimer, where he did the dialectic of the Enlightenment, where he kind of warned is that the vision of reasoning being able to solve all problems, in the books I do, it's kind of the idea, the vision of autonomous reasoning all the way down. What that unintentionally did is create this idea that we can make a perfectly reasonable society, ergo combine the explicit and the implicit on the individual and everything's going to be dandy. And what Adorno and them warn is that vision of rationality was a totalizing vision that naturally led to totalitarianism. It just kind of followed that the Enlightenment, that a child of the Enlightenment led to totalitarian forces. And I think if you do not have a vision of reality that has a kind of irony, a paradox, a tragedy, these kind of literary categories, and I'm extremely critical. I don't, I talk about how we get mental models from literature, like tragedy, paradox, and these different things. And if we don't have those categories, it has real practical consequences. Because, they're talking about, I guess, Leo Strauss, if you don't think if you think a perfect political state is possible and a perfect society is possible, then if it doesn't occur, you're going to say, we'll burn it all down or restore it or fight the people that are making it important. So nihilism in that context is more about we're going to restore the values or take it all down as we try. And so there's this kind of notion that failure to understand that there's something about life that ultimately has to be a state of trying again and failing better and trying to get these moments of the combining of the implicit and the explicit. If you do not have that vision of life, which, you mentioned Christianity, a correct understanding of the notion of fallenness is not that human beings are incapable, like they're totally depraved. I think Calvin took it too far, but this idea that there's something imperfect about the world and that therefore we can't make New Jerusalem on earth. Only God can do that, only by his grace and power. Well, whether that's true or not, there's something about that entails a powerful epistemic humility that keeps you from totalizing visions. And I think, again, it's just fascinating to me that if you don't have a vision of human life as having a certain tragedy to it, a certain inescapable destabilization, then that has real practical consequences on the social, individual, and political level, and all of it tends to lead to totalitarianism. And it's just, I think it's so important to continually kind of remember that philosophy is practical, that there are real consequences if you do not do it. And I think we're just seeing that today because people really do think that if they get the right president or the right emperor or the right job or whatever, the gap of the missing action, the divide between, the imperfection of life will be restored. And then, of course, when it doesn't, because it's only a matter of time before you find out it doesn't, then you go into disillusionment, then you sort of go into a terrible state. And then I think in that terrible state, you could be more susceptible to state and political capture.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the problem of the emanation of value from things we do or say, right?
That's right.
And you overtly vote for party A, but you get policy B, right? You don't really necessarily get what you voted for.
Absolutely.
But let's not talk about democracy. That would be too much. No, I feel like to just rewind to what you talked about a little while ago is fallenness of mankind. And I think in the book I think I'm just influenced. I've read way too much Nietzsche. But, you know, like very
That's
critical
all right.
of Christianity, you know, very critical of Christianity. But I think the greatest insight from the Bible, I think I'm definitely influenced by Milton in this respect, you know, because it's just such an amazing expansion of one paragraph of scripture. It's just, I feel like the Genesis, I can't remember which verse it is, but and the you know, Miltonian Paradise Lost is just the acceptance that things, there's not a unitary. Now that's our fundamental nature, that there is a unitary. There's not a, again, like I said, there isn't a mythical Socrates. I don't think Socrates even existed. I don't think even he existed. It's a mythical figure, like the mythical Christ didn't exist, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. Like it does. We're all flawed, right? And that's the real challenge. That's where Missing Axioms comes in, you know. And I think the positive project of this is that the more we're cognizant of that, as opposed to, you know, being, I guess, prone to capture in the like ideological sense, but, you know, like even prone to capture in the sense, you know, like the materialist sense, where we, like, you know, we can you know, materially better our souls, you know, but I'm sorry, like you are what you are. You are the human subject. You are the human. You are, and driven by the biological impetus, all this stuff. And I think we should be very cognizant of the fact that, you know, we are, like, as much as we might want to deny the, you know, Christian story of, you know, the fallen man, it's a very good description of where we ended up, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Well, and, you know, to Nietzsche's defense in the Antichrist, you know, he's critiquing escapist Christianity, which, you know, if Nietzsche never wrote that, you may have never gotten someone like N.T. Wright, who's trying to say, well, we have to understand Christianity in terms of First Temple Judaism, which is not Descartian, because absolutely Christianity had a phase of a sort of spirit, soul, separate from the body escape. And, you know, N.T. Wright talks a lot about how, no, heaven is a recreation of the world, and it is very material and very bodily, and that it's not a Descartian, you know, it's not like an escapism. But Nietzsche was, at his time, you know, very correct about so much of Christianity being escapist. What I really wish would have happened is that he would have read Kierkegaard, because, you know, Kierkegaard actually is almost a Christian Nietzsche in some respects, where he's extremely critical of Christendom to try to get back to a sort of embodied Christianity that is not escaping the paradox and irony of life, because Kierkegaard was obsessed with that. And I understand that Nietzsche was actually going to go read Kierkegaard before he died, just before he died. That would have been fascinating to sort of see, because, you know, Nietzsche really liked Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky was similarly very concerned, as you see in the character of Ivan Karmazov, of sort of just escaping to heaven to leave the suffering children behind. You know, what is God going to do about that? You know, Grand Inquisitor section and different things like that. But what I always find interesting, you know, you hear a lot of, you know, different Richard Dawkins or different of the new atheists talk about how Christianity is escapist and religion has an escapist component. Well, that's absolutely true. It can, but nationalism can have an escapist component. Materialism can have an escapist, because all ideologies and every belief system can become an ideology. Every ideology has a tendency to make us try to escape the reality that we are fallen, that we are a walking irony, a walking contradiction, this missing axiom problem. And see, one is sometimes I think a problem can happen is that when you have a kind of idea that only religion does that, well, then you're not paying attention to the ways that ideology can also contribute to escapism. And then you're caught off guard when you have some of the political movements today. So the way I like to put it is religion just tends to be kind of the most obvious examples of escapism, escaping our imperfection and fallenness and tragedy to an ideal version. But actually it can happen in any belief system because you just see it in national. You see it in the Enlightenment. If we follow Adorno, there's a escaping to rationality to make a perfect world. You see it sometimes, it depends on which transhumanist movement you're talking about, but you see that, you know, that sort of sentiment on a Homo Deus book on sort of escaping this fallenness. And that's one of the things where I like about what you're saying is because in Missing Axioms, we have to learn to live with that. It's almost like you're asking, how is the imperfect man to live? How is the imperfect person to live? Instead of like, you say, well, by perfecting himself. You're like, no, the imperfection is ontological almost is what you want to say. It's almost like embedded into our very being. And it's funny because people, if you ask them directly, do you believe perfection is possible? They say, no, of course not. And then proceed though to sort of betray that. And we know it, but then we still vote for political parties and support institutions as if they could make everything perfect. So it really is kind of quite, how is the imperfect person to live? What is the imperfect, we ask the question in philosophy, what is the good life? How do you live a good life? And a lot of that for Socrates is, by dying well or whatever. And so there's kind of a paradox there, but you almost want to ask, how to live the imperfect life. What does it mean to live the imperfect life? It's something that it's actually like, because that's to learn to live with disorientation. That's to learn to live with destability, which is hard because you have to accept that you're stuck in that state. But if you don't, it's only a matter of time, I think, before you get captured or you turn to an escapist mechanism of some kind.
There's a lot to talk about there. The important thing you said was, how is the imperfect person to live, right? And that's not really a question. That's how is the person to live, because we're all
imperfect is embedded in the phrase person. Yes.
I think so.
Yes, it is.
I've never met a perfect person so far. Maybe I'll be washing the feet of someone, Christ or something.
There you go.
One day, but not right now. I think Dawkins is a great example, just because you have the arrogance of the new atheists or materialists or whatever you want.
Right, whatever.
Which is, the empirical sciences will be our salvation and that sort of thing.
And there's an escapism there. There's a certain escapism embedded in that.
This is the thing. These, and this is the thing about value, is that all these values, again, so it's not like the empiricists don't have an explicit value or an implicit value. They have these things, but from that emanates a wider philosophical world of things we talk about. For example, the eschatology. The eschatology is that, well, either we are able to empirically prolong our lives indefinitely, or we are, we transcend the human biological condition. And that, I don't see how that's distinguishable from religion in a certain way. They keep saying, I don't know, the climate change is going to be here in 20 years,
right.
The end of the world's going to be in 20 years. We're going to have self-driving cars in 20 years instead of 20 years ago, sort of thing. I don't know. I'm as short-sighted as it seems, as someone who's concerned with the dysfunction of the explicit and implicit. And that's how I would define it. The explicit and implicit is a dysfunctional family in a way.
Okay.
I'm concerned with the here and now.
Well,
I'm concerned with the here and now. I'm not concerned with some hypothetical future. I'm not concerned with that. I don't think that's interesting to us at all. We shouldn't bother about it.
Well, and there's almost, I think, actually focus on the future has a self-hiding mechanism of the problems of today, because it's like, yes, we know you're having these problems now, but don't worry. We've got self-driving cars coming. You may want to kill your wife, your husband may be a jerk, but don't worry, the self-driving cars are coming. And there's almost this vision there that new technologies solve the problems of values. Like there's an idea that technology brings with it a solution to how to live. And it does not. It simply is a tool, of which technology is always a tool that you can use for what you want to do, but it's going to participate in the values you bring to it. But the problem is, if you, in the name of technology, perhaps have devalued the studies of, say, the humanities or philosophy or different things like that are focused on the question of values, then you have a lot of people who are inarticulate or confused about questions of values. There's that book After Virtue by Kamikaze, where he talks about we've lost the ability to have discussion anymore. We don't even know what we're doing. We're so uneducated on these topics. And he kind of similarly is like, you can't escape this. You have to talk about these subjects. But we've gone, nah, man, we'll just make better iPhones. We'll be fine. The iPhones will tell us how to live our lives. And you see, it becomes very problematic because as you get, say, more drones, weapons, powerful thing, Facebook, like, how do you use social media? Obviously we don't know. We just kind of assume people will use it well. Well, if they don't have values, they end it to get into endless conspiracy theories and extremism. And it's almost like sometimes, you mentioned Dawkins, there's this idea that if we get rid of religion, then things will take care of itself. But you have this kind of nice line where you say illusions are hydras. Once dispelled, multiple avenues of potential illusion spawn at the resolution of the previous. I love that line because there's an idea that, I give defense to Nietzsche on his critiques of escapist Christianity, but it's not the case that if you get rid of that, then everything takes care of yourself. Now, I think Nietzsche knew that. That's why he did Thus Zarathustra, and he really understood the question of how do you have new values now that religion is not there. But some of the problems is that the nihilist or atheist today are not as, dare I say, acute as Nietzsche was not as aware of those different problems as some of those older atheists were who sort of saw the challenges. And it's almost like we just think that we don't need to worry about it because technology will. And for me, in doing so much in literature, people don't even know why you read the great books. I mean, I guess to get an A on a test to name all the characters or whatever. But really, one of the reasons you read the great books is because they give you a vision of human life. Tolstoy says, every happy family is the same, but, every unhappy family is different. Pretty much what he's saying is that every family is unhappy and is sort of wrestling with one another. Or Chekhov is the great example where he says, to understand people who love one another, you have to understand that they're always misunderstanding one another. There's these, and the genius of those turns of phrases is Oscar Wilde, a friend is someone who stabs you in the front. Those little lines are, although funny, actually are embedding certain ontological truths about reality. And literature is filled with those. But in thinking literature is just something you do for pleasure, you just read for pleasure, you don't really get truths or visions of life from it because you get that from technology. I think that has contributed to a technological escapism that is happening now that has contributed to ignoring the conversation on values and us just wanting to pretend like we can actually live without values. We just want to pretend like we can live without them, that we don't have to worry about it. But like you say, you can't. It is impossible to implicit. You can only tell people you're a nihilist. You can't show it. You can only tell people you don't have values. You can't show it. And so I think it's a real dilemma that we have today that I think the work you've done in Missing Axioms has helped articulate.
One of the things that's kind of a project of the work, I mean, this is the reason why it's kind of short, is that it's supposed to be punchy, right? The sections are very punchy. There's only a couple hundred words in each section, really. So throughout the work, I sort of, as opposed to traditional philosophy where it's very logical and we're talking about very abstract things, it's a bit more. I would call it. I wouldn't even call it. I wouldn't say it was even poetical because it's not really poetry, but it's a bit more narrative in a way. I don't know what I would call it, but there's this line at the end of when I'm trying to make the point where when someone is a martyr, right? They find within the end of experience a unification of their explicit and implicit selves, whether I don't know, and those things can collide sometimes. And this is where the martyr comes about, right? So at the end of the day, the martyr comes in and says, watch what I'm about to do.
Yeah, I love that part.
Watch how much conviction. Yeah. Watch how much conviction I have in my values.
Well, and you see there,
the line is, oh yeah, watch this, right?
Yeah, watch this. Oh no, that was fantastic. Well, I don't think it's by chance that so many, Christianity talks about, they'll know you by your testimony in the blood of the martyrs. There's something about the martyr that has such a powerful conviction to it that it functions as a certain undeniable evidence. You may say, well, I don't believe in that guy, but that guy certainly believed it, and that means something to them. And it's interesting too, because these moments of unifying, I think we do want to say that it's possible for human beings, even if they can't all the time unify the implicit and the explicit, they can have moments of unifying the implicit and the explicit. And it's almost like what we want to do when we talk about how is the imperfect person to live. It's to strive for these moments, these sort of, dare I almost call them, always like kind of almost these mystical moments, these mystical visions, these visions of the unity of these glimmers of the unity of the implicit and the explicit, and to try to do more of them.
Found axioms.
What's that? Found axioms. Yeah.
Found axioms.
Oh, I just knocked my speaker off. It was like the trumpet going off. Boom, found axioms. But no, that's exactly right. You know, the glimmers of these kind of moments of found axioms. Well, and it's also too, you know, for me, I talk about how the true isn't the rational, how there's always a gap between the true and the rational. You know, what is rational is relative to what you believe is true, but that means you have to have a truth before you can have a rationality. So how in the world do you pick your truth? So there's always a kind of gap. And the more you acknowledge that gap, the more existentially destabilizing it can be. But the more you kind of lean into that existential instability, the more you lean into it, the moment you can find glimmers of, you know, where you can actually live in such a way that you embody your truth, even if you can't rationally understand it. And I love beauty, aesthetic visions, because when you know, when you said found axioms there, there's almost an aesthetic vision there. There's a moment of beauty where it's kind of beautiful, where the person combines the
this is the thing, right? This is the car crash, right? Which is a horrific event. But there's a certain beauty in a car crash, which is really strange. within our you know state where things always go wrong and people get injured and stuff, there's a found axioms, you know. There's a beautiful car crash within the horrible thing, which is the car crash.
Oh, well, that's the only reason people watch NASCAR in America. They watch it for wrecks and different things. You know, that's what they watch it for. Well, and Zizek talks about this with the crucifixion. You know, the idea of where you have God on a cross, right, where God is dead right there, and yet there's something about that that's also this powerful symbol of resurrection and overcoming. And I think that's because there's something in that topsy-turviness. You know, if life is ultimately living with these kind of gaps that you're describing between true as rational and implicit and explicit, then there's something about that image that has a certain beauty to it, even though it's horrible. And it's always interesting that in Christianity, instead of making the empty tomb the main symbol, they decided to make it the cross, right? They could have made it the empty tomb, but they chose to do the cross, which is quite interesting. And it reminds me too, Walker Percy had this line where he said, if everyone is standing on their heads, then the only way to show them how to stand straight up is to look like you're standing on your head. And so likewise, there's something about the person who, there's something about these moments of death. There's something about these moments of sort of the martyr, these moments of sort of trying to combine the implicit and explicit, even though ultimately it's impossible. And so it kind of looks kind of like a waste of time to even do it, because tomorrow it may be unraveled. And yet there's something about that precisely in that difference, that sort of strangeness, that absurdity even, that is a glimmer of how things can be and how things can go together in an aesthetic vision where they can go together. But again, to sort of bring some of the things we've said, if your vision though of life is totalizing, where it is possible not to have gaps, then you're always going to have utopian visions. You're always going to have visions of, beauty.
The whole world standing on their heads.
Yeah, right. And that's right. And it's going to be complete opposite. Well, again, Zizek has that nice idea where he says, it's precisely at the moments when mankind thinks it's achieved its pinnacle, its quintessence, it's that the greatest terror is unleashed. You know, it's precisely at the utopian moments that what does utopia mean? It means nowhere. So the moment you get utopia, it has this negating principle. It unleashes this terror. It's French Revolution leads to the reign of terror, right? You know, there's this explosion of these things. And again, that's just the practical consequence where if you don't learn to live with the gaps of missing axioms and things like that, you end up striving for a utopian vision that the moment you achieve it, it's a moment of great horror. What comes to mind is, the first Indiana Jones movie where they get the Raiders of the Lost Ark, and at the end they open, the Ark, and it's sand and all the ghosts come out and everyone melts. Everyone kind of melts. So basically what we're saying, everyone, is that if you don't go out and buy Missing Axioms and learn the lessons of it, you're going to head toward a totalitarian vision and you're going to melt. You are going to melt like the end of the Lost Ark. So you need to buy this book because you don't want to end up like the Nazis at the end of the Lost Ark. Well, I think that's a good sales pitch, Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes, I have appreciated this so much. Where can people get your book? And what are you working on now? And I also think everyone needs needs to watch the video where you talk about being a non-academic philosopher, which I just love so much. And I hope we can do this again. But where can people get your book? What are you working on now? Just all those open, big life direction questions.
Yeah, so if you go to missingaxioms.com, missingaxioms.com, I hope it'll be in the description, hopefully.
Yes.
Direct to the Gumroad page, so it's available in digital, because it's a short book, but it's like I said, punchy.
It's very good.
And right now I'm really focusing on a second book, which I really hope will be out before the end of the year, which is polemic on the topic of free will, eschatology. It really, in a strange sense, it carries on from Missing Axioms, but to mythology and the way we think about things. And there's this idea of freedom that we've had in Western society for a long time, and it sort of challenges that. But yeah, so missingaxioms.com is the if you want to buy the book, and barnes.substack.com. So if you go to Barnes on Substack, that's me. Follow there. Free essays, all for free.
Excellent.
Not bad at all.
Well, wonderful. Well, certainly, Mr. Barnes, like I said, your elegance is only competed with by your insight. They go to get you. It's just wonderful to read. Often when somebody reads philosophical texts, they have to just kind of clip their nose and deal with the bad prose, but your work is just wonderfully elegant and punchy. And also too, well, there's something about quality over quantity, right? I mean, you get 800 pages, and if at the end of it, you're like, you don't get anything out of it, who cares? But it's very difficult not to get something very meaningful and deep out of every section of the book. So it's certainly worth people's time. And like we said, everyone, you don't want to end up melting. So go get this book. Do not miss out. And Mr. Barnes, I really appreciate your time. I hope we can do this again soon. And I do definitely see on some of the work that you've done on Dante, your insights on Milton, Homer, and there's a logical flow into the question of freedom from the question of missing axioms and the authentic self. They go together very well. So we're all looking forward to that second book and how it comes. So thank you so much for your time, Mr. Barnes. This has been a delight.
Cool. It's been great. Thanks, Danny.